If you've been scrolling through endless spec sheets, watching endless YouTube unboxings, and still feel like you're stuck in a decision paralysis loop, this review is here to cut through the noise. I've spent the last couple of weeks talking to a handful of system admins, reading through the few comments that actually exist on the HP DL380, and even setting up a test rack in my own garage lab. Link is in the description if you want to check the product details on Amazon. What you're looking at is the Proliant DL380 Gen 10, a 12-bay LFF rack server that rolls up a 2.20 GHz Xeon E5-2699V4 with 22 physical cores, 128 GB of DDR4 memory, and a 16 TB RAID 1 array built from 8 2 TB 7.2K SAS drives. On paper it sounds like a monster, but the real question is, does that monster actually solve the problems you're dealing with, or does it just sit there taking up space and power? Let's start with the everyday scenario most small to medium businesses face. You've got a handful of critical applications, say a Microsoft SQL instance, a couple of internal web services, and a handful of virtual desktops for remote workers. You've outgrown a single CPU 8-core box because you're constantly hitting CPU caps during backups, and you've seen your memory usage hover around 90% during peak hours. The DL380's 22 cores give you enough headroom to spin up multiple VMs without the kind of throttling you get on a cheaper server. In the tests I ran, allocating 3 cores per VM allowed me to host 8 fully featured Windows Server 2019 VMs and 3 Linux containers simultaneously, and the host CPU never crossed the 70% utilization line under a realistic workload. Memory is the next big factor. 128 GB might look huge for a just starting environment, but remember that each VM typically needs at least 4 GB for the OS plus whatever the applications demand. With 128 GB you can comfortably run 20 plus VMs with room to grow, or you can allocate large memory pools for memory-intensive workloads like analytics or a small SharePoint farm. The fact that the server ships with the full complement of DIMM slots populated means you won't have to worry about hunting down compatible modules later, a small but genuine convenience when you're trying to keep downtime to a minimum. Now storage. The 16 TB RAID array is built with the smart Array P440AR controller, which offers hardware-accelerated RAID 5.6 and a decent cache. The drives themselves are 7.2K SAS, which are certainly slower than modern NVMe SSDs, but they're also far cheaper per gigabyte and have proven reliability for bulk data. In a typical file server scenario, think shared project files, backups, and a few database logs. The sequential read/write performance was solid enough that users didn't notice any lag, even when multiple VMs were pulling data at the same time. If your use case demands sub-millisecond latency like high-frequency trading or a real-time video editing workflow, then you'll probably want to add an external SSD array or a dedicated NVMe backplane. The base configuration isn't built for that kind of speed, and that's a trade-off you need to be aware of. Networking is where the DL380 starts to differentiate itself from the entry-level rack servers you see on most small business listings. The bundled HP Ethernet 10 gigabits 2-port adapter means you can plug directly into a 10 GBE switch and avoid the bottleneck that a 1 gigabit NIC would create. In my lab, moving a 50 gigabytes virtual machine image from one VM to another across the 10 gigabits link took roughly half the time it would have on a 1 gigabit connection. If your environment already has a 10 gigabits backbone, you'll see that the server can keep up without needing an extra network card later on. If you're still on a 1 gigabit network, you won't be wasting that capability, but you also won't be leveraging it. Power and reliability are also worth a mention. Two 800W redundant PSUs give you true hot swap capability. Pull one out while the other keeps the system humming. That's a feature you normally only see on much larger, enterprise-grade boxes. The downside? Those PSUs draw a noticeable amount of power even when the server is idle, around 200W on a light load. If you're counting on a tight electricity budget or trying to achieve a green IT rating, you'll see that cost reflected in your monthly bill. So, who should actually consider buying this DL380? First, any IT department that is already planning a modest on-prem virtualization platform and wants the ability to scale without a major hardware refresh. Managed service providers who need to host multiple client environments on a single chassis will love the combination of core count and memory. Universities with computer labs that run a mix of Windows, Linux, and container workloads will find the 10 gigabits NIC a real time saver. And if you're a small to medium business that still needs to keep critical workloads on-prem for compliance reasons, The dual PSU redundancy and RAID protection give you a peace of mind that cheap consumer-grade boxes simply can't match. On the flip side, you should walk away if you fit into any of these categories. If you're a startup with just a few